Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on land acquisition strategies for building flood resilience. My name is Logan Sand. I'm a recovery and resilience planner here in the Colorado Department of Local Affairs in the Division of Local Government. Just a couple quick housekeeping items here. Today's webinar is the last in the 2018 Planning for Hazards webinar series. This webinar is going to be recorded and it will be posted on planningforhazards.com. After today's presentation, all the attendees and folks who weren't able to participate will receive a follow-up email with a link to the webinar slides, some of the additional resources and handouts, as well as the AICP CM credit information, which you can see towards the bottom of your screen. We have an awesome and amazing panel of speakers today. Joining us is Nicole Amon, who is a senior community planner with FEMA. Nicole manages the mitigation planning program for Region 8. We also have Nicole Wobus, who is a long-range planning and policy manager with Boulder County. Nicole leads the county's coordinated land use planning engagements with other communities, manages updates to the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan and Land Use Code, in addition to managing resiliency-related efforts for the Land Use Department. Next, we have Charlie Johnson, who is a senior land agent with Larimer County. As a senior land agent for about 18 years, Charlie has been responsible for the acquisition of various property interests for the Departments of Engineering and Natural Resources. This includes fee simple and conservation purchases, property donations, as well as trail easements for regional trails, and also the purchase of right-of-way and various forms of easements for road, bridge, and drainage projects throughout Larimer County. Last but not least, we also have Megan Flanagan, who is a land conservation planning and resource program manager with Larimer County. Megan oversees the Department of Natural Resources, land acquisitions, planning, construction project management, natural and cultural resource stewardship, trails, and weeds and forestry programs. So quite a few programs there. Just a quick overview of the webinar today. We'll begin by briefly discussing how land acquisition as a land use tool works, some of the key benefits, and a couple of the challenges that communities should consider when looking at land acquisition planning as something for their community. Then FEMA will discuss sort of their role in land acquisition planning and some of the resources available to all Colorado communities and local governments. And then we'll dig into the first of our case studies, which is Boulder County and acquisition and open space resiliency activities, followed by the Larimer County work in flood resilience projects and processes. So by this point, everyone knows outright avoidance of hazards is sort of an obvious planning approach and solution for making communities safer. Avoiding hazardous areas can really be accomplished through a regulatory approach and regulations such as land use tools like overlay zoning, or through incentives like cluster subdivisions. However, we're going to be focusing on a non-regulatory avoidance approach, which is land acquisition. The protection of environmentally sensitive areas, which this tool falls under in the Planning for Hazards guide, is the protection of environmentally sensitive areas is a high priority for a lot of Colorado communities for a number of reasons. Generally, they offer a variety of benefits, including beautiful scenery, opportunities for outdoor recreation, plant and wildlife habitat, which is very critical for a lot of the economic vitality for communities across the state. But more importantly, preserving sensitive areas often provides an additional benefit of protecting citizens and property against natural hazards, such as flood or wildfire. For example, protecting floodplains and the wild-urban interface not only safeguards natural resources, but they also help reduce vulnerability to flood and wildfire hazards. So just touching on sort of how land acquisition works. Land acquisition is the acquirement of private land by the government. This can either be local, state, or federal, in fee simple through a purchase or donation. Land acquisition helps local governments achieve multiple community goals, such as watershed protection and building partnerships with watershed coalitions, for example, but also the provision of open space and parks. Critical to this webinar in particular is land acquisition is a mitigation technique to protect against hazards by removing the development potential from vulnerable or risk-prone areas. And land acquisition is a tool not only to protect sensitive areas, but it also is really important because it involves a lot of community buy-in and also with leadership and working with property owners. So implementing land acquisition programs, does require political will, community support, and funding. And generally, successful land acquisition programs are well supported by the local governing body and the community generally, because it hits on a high priority community goal, whether that is preservation of open space, hazard mitigation, protecting cultural resources and scenic lands, etc. This often leads to the establishment of a funding mechanisms for acquiring sensitive lands that can advance these community goals. Some of the tools that we often see when it comes to funding have been the implementation through direct line item appropriations, taxes, or fees such as stormwater utility fees, tax incentives, and bonds. In particular to Colorado, other instances and other opportunities exist through grant funding and grant programs such as what the Great Outdoors Colorado might offer, or FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance funding. But it's important to work in partnership with those organizations as well as private and nonprofit organizations. But also, we shouldn't forget that while land trusts are more often thought of as a preservation organization, they often are able to assist communities with traditional land acquisition projects, generally because they have a lot of resources, staffing, funding that are usually readily available to assist communities in land acquisition projects. So there are a lot of great benefits from land acquisition, and some of these strategies that we'll hear about and themes that will resonate through the rest of this presentation. But land acquisition does complement policies and strategies found in a community's comprehensive plan or other plans that are associated with future land use, open space preservation, hazard mitigation, community wildfire protection planning, parks and recreation, environmental protection, et cetera. Kind of already touched on this, but provides a wide range of natural resource protection and as a hazard mitigation technique, and does reach these other objectives when it comes to recreation, environmental protection, habitat preservation. A key benefit, I would say, in land acquisition is that it does achieve community objectives through a permanent solution versus relying on land development policies or regulations, which can be changed over time or susceptible, to a new creation of a city council, for example, or new policies, regulations, whatnot. Lastly, as a key benefit, land acquisition and supplementing strategies can remove land from development pressure that might otherwise be likely or highly desirable to developers. We also need to be sort of cognizant as we talk about this through our webinar and thinking about what are some of these big community challenges with this type of land use planning tool. And likely the greatest challenge for communities is going to be the money it takes to purchase sensitive lands. Also, it's really important to understand that land acquisition requires in resolving complicated coordination issues among stakeholders or parties involved. Communities need to have a higher level of technical expertise to administer land acquisitions, especially when it comes to the capability and knowledge of real estate transactions in Colorado. Any land that a jurisdiction does acquire might be subject also to conservation easements or easements that dictate how the land is to be maintained and used. If the land is located in a hazard area, staff probably need to consider whether the easement requirements allow specific mitigation activity on that land. And then I think finally, as a big challenge, which we already hit upon, is that it does require a lot of political will, community support, and financial capital to get this planning tool up and running. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Amon to talk about FEMA's role in land acquisition and flood mitigation, especially with acquisition and buyout programs. So Nicole, if you want to unmute yourself. Oh, you're already there.
Great. Thanks, Logan. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Amon. I'm a planner based in our FEMA Region 8 office in Denver. And I work with the states of Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, North and South Dakota. And I'm going to speak today about FEMA's acquisition buyout program. Acquisitions are funded under FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. And the grant program looks at communities who have properties, structures that are located in high natural risk areas. We're talking about high flood risk, but also landslide risk, where we see land subsidence and soil erosion type issues. And we see two types of acquisition: structure demolition and structure relocation. Under structure demolition, we remove the buildings, structures, and maintain the land as open space. Property owners are reimbursed for the fair market value of their real property, including land and structures, as well as many of the costs associated with that process. And there's guidance that specifically details everything that's covered under the grant. And so that's the handouts that we have on the right-hand screen. You'll find that there in the HMA fact sheet. And that also goes for structure relocation as well. And I'll be referencing those documents a little bit later in the presentation. So primarily in our region, we do see acquisition demolition. We also buy out vacant land, clearing of open space, but not solely as a conservation action, although that is an added benefit. And I should clarify, FEMA does not purchase undeveloped lots unless they are part of a larger project where we're already acquiring structures. This is also important because it helps in aggregating the benefits for the cost-benefit analysis, and we do require a cost-benefit analysis for this grant program. And that being said, Region 8 offers a lot of benefit cost analysis training with our states jointly. So this really helps for folks when they're really interested in doing the project development. I'm going to get to our next slide. Logan, do you mind moving me to the next slide? For some reason, oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you. So there's three specific FEMA grant programs that fund acquisition projects, and they're all housed in our mitigation assistance program. I'm going to back up one. Okay. I'm not clicking any. Okay, there we go. So I think most notably, folks are familiar with our first one, which is our Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, also known as HMGP. Right. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And this grant program is available under a Presidential Major Disaster Declaration, and that amount of funding is available based on the total federal assistance provided by FEMA. And just for some context, for the 2013 Colorado floods, FEMA provided a little over $13 million in mitigation acquisition funding for properties located in high flood risk areas that suffered substantial damages. Looks like our slides are going for a ride. Okay, so our other programs, there's also eligible funding under our non-disaster related programs. This is pre-disaster mitigation, PDM, as well as flood mitigation assistance. Yes, typically we do see most of our projects under HMGP. It's also a lot easier, as most of us know, directly post-disaster to galvanize folks, especially for personal home acquisitions. Especially then the situation is a lot more dire and folks are really willing to give up their homes and relocate. But I do really want to emphasize there is funding on an annual basis under our PDM and FMA programs. They are annually funded, congressionally appropriated grants. Each year Congress sets the amount. And for this upcoming funding cycle, PDM was appropriated at $235.2 million and FMA was $160 million. So we're talking almost $400 million. And last year it only totaled around $250 million, which is great. So we're really seeing quite a jump. It's a huge priority, and it's something if we can get folks thinking it before the disaster happens, that would be ideal. So like most of our FEMA federal grants, the funds are managed by the state. A local government can sponsor a buyout project. They submit the application to the state. And I always like to clarify for some folks that individuals and businesses don't apply directly to the state. And FEMA usually, typically the local governments will apply on their behalf. Colorado has their own handbook, which we've included as one of the resources for this presentation. FEMA works really closely with the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. They are the ones who manage all the Colorado-related acquisition projects that we've funded. We work very closely with Scott Baldwin, who's your Deputy State Hazard Mitigation Officer. He knows all of these projects very well inside and out. And so what's really good about each state, not every state, most states do have their own handbook. It goes through project and scope development, all the required elements of a project application. It always varies a little bit per state, so it's really good to take a look at the Colorado one. I guess, yeah, if we can go to the next slide, Logan, that'd be great. So I've also included some additional resources as well. So we were just referencing the Colorado handbook, which I was talking about, but I've also included FEMA's fact sheets on property acquisitions for open space, a super high level document and very general, but it's a great primer for anyone who's just sort of interested in reading about this at a high level. The state guide will absolutely give you more detail. I've also included our hazard mitigation grant assistance or program brochure. And that really gets into the critical detail about putting together your grant application. It discusses cost sharing. Mostly we have a 75 to 25% cost share. There are exceptions. The brochure also discusses eligibility in more detail and kind of gives you an idea of different project examples. And finally, there are two other resources that I wanted to discuss. And Logan, if it's possible, yeah, the next slide would be great. Great, thank you. So these are two other great resources that I've come across and I wanted to include in this presentation. They were produced by the Environmental Law Institute and the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill's Institute for the Environment. And those handouts, they should be, yeah, they're part of our hand. They're on the right as well. And one of them is a guide on financing and incentivizing floodplain buyouts, as well as their action guide for local governments. And they are excellent resources. They were developed in the last 2 years. They discuss FEMA and HUD's program, Housing and Urban Development. They also have a buyout program. And they also provide examples of how various states have implemented their buyout programs. Excuse me one second. And most importantly, the funding mechanisms, discussing how they funded the non-federal match and different creative ways that they've done. So it really provides a nice best practice and gives you this overarching view, going kind of into the ins and outs that one should consider when you're funding and implementing a buyout program. And thanks, that's all I have.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Sorry about the technical difficulty, folks. I think we're on track here, but the next speaker we have is Nicole Wobus. So go ahead and take it away. Nicole, tell us about Boulder County's acquisition and open space related resiliency activities.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. This first slide shows an image of one of our buyout program properties. I'm going to be talking about our home buyout program, our Creating Room for the River project, and some parks and open space resiliency efforts as well. Let's see if I can get the slides to advance here. The 2013 flood had a major impact on the county. We've had about $216 million in spending for flood recovery. It's been a pretty major effect on our county organization, and we're proud of the efforts that we are going to be talking about here today. So first, I'm going to talk about policy alignment, just generally how this work lines up with the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan, as well as our hazard mitigation plan. And then I'm going to provide an overview of the key efforts, challenges, successes, and status of these three programs. Oh, sorry, there we go. So just our comprehensive plan natural hazards element has a variety of very relevant goals listed in terms of the first one here. We have inappropriate development in natural hazard areas should be reduced as much as possible. I won't go through all of them, but there's also quite a bit of relevant material in our hazard mitigation plan, as well as our open space element of our comprehensive plan, and our environmental resources element of our comprehensive plan really talks about the importance of maintaining natural stream function, and sort of that is a theme that carries through a lot of our master plans and documents in the policy documents in the county. So I'm going to talk about our home buyout program first. So properties were purchased, flood damaged properties were purchased at pre-flood value, and that land is, as Nicole Limon was talking about, converted to undeveloped property in perpetuity, so the land cannot be used for future development. We had 47 properties acquired, about 89 acres of land. The program was launched shortly after the flood in the fall of 2013. The first closing that took place was in May of 2015, and we stopped accepting applications in the summer of 2016. Our last closing was the spring of 2017, and our last demolition late 2017. The reimbursement activity has continued through this year and is mostly done now. And then the property management and reporting is ongoing. The funding came from FEMA, the program that the HMGP program that Nicole Limon spoke about, as well as HUD through the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. Just a bit about, I guess, a little bit more on the policy alignment and sort of the alignment with the county's priorities. So the FEMA program funded 75% of the FEMA-funded projects. We had some projects that were funded entirely by the CDBG-DR, some that were funded through FEMA. And for those that were funded through FEMA, that 75% came from FEMA. Of the remaining 25%, half of that was CDBG-DR funds that the county chose as a priority to prioritize and allocate toward this program, and the remainder came from the state. And Hickenlooper declared after the flood that the state would commit to funding that portion of the local match. So we had we have an online mapping tool, I should say, if you wanted to look on our website and sort of dig into the details of some of these properties that were acquired. Some of these dots are several dots stacked on top of each other. So there's adds up to 47, but we had 70 total applications, 23 withdrew. We had 19 funded through the HMGP, the FEMA funding source, and then the remaining 28 were CDBG-DR fully funded projects. So just in terms of the money side of things, the total spending was just over $23 million, with about $9.8 million coming from the HMGP source that Nicole Limon was speaking about. So it sounds like we accounted for quite a bit of the state's spending on buyouts. The average home buyout price was $400,000, and just interesting to note here that the demolition and revegetation costs were over $100,000, whereas the overall program delivery costs were about $25,000. So there's a lot of costs that go into these projects that go beyond the cost of the property itself. And I guess I just highlight here, we had the staffing was a significant, there was a lot of staffing involved. We had 2 full-time staff at sort of the height of the program activity, managing the demolition and revegetation activity, as well as the acquisitions. And it took a great deal of cross-departmental coordination and support. We had major contributions of time that were unreimbursed from the attorney's office, finance, land use, parks and open space, transportation, and even the sheriff's office. And ongoing property management will take place by Parks and Open Space. The properties have been transferred to be under their management. So this slide just kind of shows, I know you can't read the details, but sort of the big picture view of all the different players who are involved in that left-hand column. This, acronyms for our various different departments, but where the colors correspond with where they kind of plugged in through the process, from the intake and evaluation, the appraisals. A lot happened before the closing even took place in terms of environmental assessment and historic review. And then after the closing, we moved into the demolition and revegetation stage, where our Parks and Open Space staff was really instrumental in coming up with revegetation plans and seed mixes that we're most likely to take in our climate, given our conditions we're dealing with here, and then ongoing Parks and Open Space management. So I'm not really sure why this is not, there we go. Okay, so this slide just is intended to show the major component of the program that was demolition and revegetation. It's each property required extensive planning to remove structures and ensure that the property was restored back to its natural state and ecological function. You can see on the right the image of bulldozers or heavy equipment tearing down structures was a big aspect of the program that was challenging for both homeowners as well. You know, it was a significant aspect of the program, watching these homes be removed, and took a great deal of coordination and cost, as I mentioned before. In the lower right-hand corner of this slide, we've got the picture of the seed mix that came from our own Parks and Open Space property and was tailored to these properties for revegetation. Some lessons learned from the buyout program. So staffing was really significant and extensive. The demolition and revegetation component of the program was also costly and involved quite an involved process, and utilities coordination, et cetera, quite extensive. The time frames, there was a great deal of coordination. There were many factors involved with the timing of carrying out this program that were beyond our control. Took a lot of patience and a lot of careful coordination. The communications, both internal and external, were really critical and challenging because there were just so many moving parts that kind of changed from day to day as we learned as we were going. The securing the properties was significant. The sheriff's office was involved in having to communicate with neighbors about what was going on the property and what can and can't happen on the property. And then program documentation and for management on audit purposes, just trying to keep really great, solid records on each of the properties. I think a big lesson learned was the human aspects of the program. So our team had some folks who were really just almost acting as sort of social workers shortly after the flood when people were coming in, not sure what to do with their properties, and trying to understand as this program was just getting off the ground. There's a lot of emotion involved, sometimes pending foreclosures, where there was a great deal of stress around the timing of the closing, and again, factors beyond our control became very challenging, and just a lot of flood trauma. And then one thing we talked about internally, we described these properties as snowflakes because each one had its own unique challenges, and there was landfill discovered on one. There was all sorts of things discovered that one could not anticipate, and so we like to think of them as snowflakes. And we learned a lot as we were going. So some tips for getting started if other communities would like to pursue a program like this. So plan for staffing and cross-departmental coordination is really key. Ensuring that acquisition is the best strategy to accomplish your jurisdiction's objectives, given the resources available, because it is a major, major commitment from many departments. This image here is a kind of a closing ceremony for staff, I guess, where we all got together at a property, one of the last properties to undergo revegetation, and just sort of acknowledge with the property owners how significant the efforts were and how many different people were involved. And then establish the program and project workflow and practices as early as possible, recognizing that things will probably evolve as you go, and trying to adhere as much to the updating those practices. But it's really key to be monitoring how things are changing and ensuring that you've got your systems in place even as they evolve. So next I'm going to talk about creating room for the river project. And so first, I guess to transition, we've talked about how challenging the home buyout program, the post-flood home buyout program was, and how resource intensive it was. So why consider introducing an ongoing river-focused mitigation program? So the buyout program was really just dealing with the post-flood, the flood damaged properties. And so the creating room for the river project was to look ahead at, does it make sense to have an ongoing program that does this, an acquisition program, or addressing other kind of mitigation related activities. So the facts kind of speak for themselves. We have a lot of structures in the floodway, over 900 and over 3,000 in flood prone areas, parcels with at least one structure impacted by 3+ hazards. In terms of the hazards we looked at, it's over 3 361 here. And so we just have a lot of indicators here telling us that there's a lot of structures that could benefit from being removed from the floodplain or elevated or mitigated in some way. So we're looking at protecting life, health, and property, protecting public and private infrastructure, habitat and quality of life, improving natural hazard risk awareness, and interagency coordination, and reducing rescue and relief efforts down ultimately, and economic and social hardships. So we chose to pursue this study to look at what an ongoing program might be like. And a really important component of that was taking lessons learned from our home buyout program, our post-flood buyout program. And actually, one of the handouts available on the right side of the screen here is the final report from this Room for the River study. And there's an appendix to that is our lessons, a pretty extensive lessons learned summary from our buyout program. So just so you know, as a resource going forward. So the Creating Room for the River project is kind of two phases. The first phase was a study and an action plan that was completed in the spring of 2018. And then the second phase is getting underway, and it's to confirm the program approach, procure contractor services, and really pilot some program establishment activities. So the first phase got us pretty far along in the process, but left a lot of kind of question marks in terms of how the county really would prioritize maybe one hazard over another, or whether it would be more of a mitigation-focused program versus an acquisition-focused program. And so there's a lot of decision-making that still would need to happen, and that this pilot stage of things will help us get to that point. So I'm going to talk mostly about the phase one of the program, the initial study. And so the study components were just looking at different program structure options, like how do you, when there's not an impending, post-flood situation that you're facing, like how do you go about recruiting people, and what is the overall structure of the program look like? We looked at potential funding sources, recognizing that FEMA may not be like the whole or ongoing in perpetuity kind of funding source for something like this. Risk mapping based on potential initial criteria, which I'll get into in a minute, and there was some additional data analysis as well. So this is just to show you kind of the analysis that we looked at. One of the outputs, we looked at a variety of different priorities for different program models. So what we've got here is mitigation strategies down the left, with a variety of different strategies in addition to property acquisition being looked at, deed restrictions, elevation, relocation, et cetera, and codes and policies, and then just kind of evaluated them based on these practical criteria like property owner engagement and technical factors and implementation factors. There's a lot of layers behind this, but this is kind of a roll-up of just to give you a flavor for the kind of analysis we did. And then this slide shows the various different, so for our mapping tool, a key element of the study was creating this mapping tool where we didn't end up with here's the final result. It was more that the creation of the tool was the final result, and that we now have this resource that we can pull in a bunch of different data layers and develop and basically score properties based on hazard-related factors as well as other parcel just general characteristics, and come up with a score, an acquisition score, to help us prioritize parcels for acquisition, both for improved parcels, structures, as well as vacant parcels. So it's really that the tool was the result there, but we have this valuable resource we can go back to and calibrate as needed. So some outcomes from the Room for the River project. We presented our analysis of options. We identified some immediate next steps and a 3-year action plan. All of this is available in that report. And again, we're in the phase 2 where we've secured funding for a pilot phase. And now I'm going to move on to our Parks and Open Space related activities. So immediately after the flood, we were really in emergency response mode. Our Parks and Open Space staff was in emergency response mode. Then looked through spring of 2014 at kind of assessing threats and mitigation opportunities, and then moved into the sort of long-term visioning and prioritization. And then just important to note that the flood recovery projects have taken quite some time already, and there's going to be activity ongoing past 2020. And it's something important to note is our Parks and Open Space properties, our Parks and Open Space Department, or the county with Parks and Open Space implementing, manages over 100,000 acres of open space. Those include both properties owned in fee as well as conservation easements. And so those properties were acquired not for the purpose of flood mitigation, and so it's just something unique to point out. They were acquired for broader open space values with sales tax funding and grants. But the flood mitigation work and the resiliency work definitely aligns with the ecological values that were behind the purchases and acquisition of those properties. So there were really 4 major projects that Parks and Open Space has engaged in since the flood. Our South St. Vrain project, the Breaches and Reach 3 at St. Vrain project, and then the Reservoirs project is really a separate project. And then Pella Crossing, which is restoring a very heavily used Parks and Open Space property and improving some ecological values or ecological functions there. So kind of overarching way of looking at the disaster recovery and resilience work on the Parks and Open Space properties. Of course, you could get into a great deal of detail on any one of these, but objectives were to increase floodplain connectivity, incorporate natural channel design and stream restoration, protect and restore the natural creek and riparian habitat, and flood risk mitigation looking down the road. Other factors that were considered were trails and public access, cultural resources. In a lot of cases, structures were retained and moved, historic structures, looking at water infrastructure, dealing with reservoir and ditch infrastructure. So a lot of factors at play, and then you can see the cute little Prebbles Meadow jumping mouse, and all of this work and construction for restoration was done with protection of careful attention to protection of natural species, or species like the Prebbles Meadow jumping mouse. So this is just a before. This slide shows the before, like kind of post-flood condition, the during construction for restoration on the upper right, and then the after. So some really impressive work has been done to restore natural function of these streams. I'm really glossing over, there's quite a bit to these projects, but just trying to give you the 30,000-foot view. So some lessons learned, really just the designing and the design stage, it's really important to involve everyone up front. In terms of funding, working within the scope of what's allowed can be challenging because a lot of times we don't define what, we have to just work within what's available, and sometimes the funding sources have requirements that can be tricky. It may not necessarily align up with the way we would do things. But we have to make the best of that situation. Contracting, really be careful to prescribe exactly what you're looking for. Have warranty language in writing, and evaluate and really learn from the experience. Some tips for getting started. So allow plenty of time for the upfront work related to funding, permitting, and just really recognize that there are phases to the planning and design of a project. And that can take quite a while to carry out. Consider stakeholder involvement, including who's involved, when, and for what purpose. It sounds simple, but that can be a pretty major aspect of a project. And then setting expectations early about what can be done and what will be done. And then to the extent possible, creating an interdisciplinary team, because there's a lot of different perspectives and internal stakeholder valuable perspectives to bring into these projects. I don't know why it's not advancing. That's, I believe, my last slide, and I'm trying to advance it onto the next presentation, but maybe, Logan, you need to do that.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and advance it here. So thanks, Nicole. That was a great overview and a lot of amazing work going on in Boulder County, and some really great tips and strategies for folks to get started and think about things. And I'm going to go ahead and, without further ado, turn this over to Charlie and Megan and talk about what's going on in Larimer County.
All right, thank you, Logan. This is Megan Flanagan and Charlie Johnson with Larimer County Natural Resources. And let's see, Logan, do I have control of the advancing?
Yeah, you should now.
There we go. All right. Hi, everyone. And we want to talk a little bit about some background about Larimer County, mostly our Natural Resources Department, which includes our parks and open space acquisitions, and then give a couple case studies post-flood on work we did on both the Big Thompson and the Poudre River up here in Larimer County. We have a 1/4-cent sales tax we use to conserve land for open space purposes, values scenic, recreation, community separators, wildlife habitat. That tax has been around since 1996, and since then we've conserved about 50,000 acres in a mixture of fee lands that the county owns and manages, and conservation easements that are in private land ownership. Some of these properties are along the river corridors or in hazard areas, so they serve that function. But really the primary reason we've acquired these lands is for those conservation values I already mentioned. We do have an adopted acquisition process that's pretty detailed. We take that process through several iterations with our Department Open Lands Advisory Board, and they ultimately make a recommendation on land acquisitions to our Board of County Commissioners. We evaluate lands for acquisition at a starting point if they're in a priority conservation area within an adopted master plan. We have about 7 priority areas countywide. We look to balance the lands we're acquiring geographically and between fee and conservation easements, mostly for financial reasons. We have a number of financial partners with the incorporated cities that share part of our sales tax or have their own funding sources, and a lot of private landowners that we get donations or partial donations for.
Conservation easements are a really good tool for conservation, but they're also a good way to deal with river corridors, because within a conservation easement, you have reserved rights and restricted rights. So within that river corridor, you can stipulate what can occur within the river corridor. And another benefit of a conservation easement is that it costs less than a full fee simple purchase. Conservation easements are valued based on the reserved rights that a landowner retains. So what you pay for is that appraised value after the easement is in place. So typically you'll pay between 50 and 70% of the full value for a conservation easement. So your money goes further with partnerships with other entities, with the landowner, and the landowner has the ability to donate either all or a portion of the value of a conservation easement, and they can receive both federal and state tax benefits. The state of Colorado has a great tax credit program where they can get back funds through that process. Today we'll be looking at 2 areas. The center red star is Highway 34, where the Big Thompson River is. That has had 2 epic floods, one in 1976 and one in 2013. The star to the right is on the Poudre River, and the Poudre had less of a flood impact in 2013, but we've done some good conservation in that area with other entities, and in particular on the River Bluffs open space. On the Big Thompson River in 1976, we had a huge flood, and through our buyout program in 1976, we acquired 163 small parcels, anywhere from less than 1/3 of an acre up to 5 acres. And we have managed those as recreation and open space parcels for all these years. Many of these are tucked in between other homes and other properties. So in terms of land management, it's been very challenging. And we also have developed 4 dedicated parks through the Big Thompson Canyon that we'll discuss here in a moment. Here you see the Big Thompson River corridor with our 4 parks, and we'll discuss in detail the Glade Park, which is closer to Loveland, the Narrows Park, the Forks Park, which is at the confluence of the North Fork of the Big Thompson and the Big Thompson, and the Sleepy Hollow Park to the west, closer to Estes Park.
So post-flood, we, Larimer County, we partnered with a grant from Great Outdoors Colorado and the City of Loveland, CDOT. We have a local Big Thompson Watershed Coalition group that had formed to really take a look at all the parcels that we had owned since the 1976 flood. So as Charlie said, there were 163, and of those, we only, really were managing 4 parks worth, which some of those were comprised of multiple parcels. But then there were a number of parcels that were deemed substantially damaged post the 2013 flood. And we really wanted to take a fresh look throughout the Big Thompson River corridor as to what we would do with all these parcels and have a really concerted plan. So ultimately, we identified 4 categories. Category 1 and 2, which would be lands that we would retain in county ownership and have some type of public access and actively pursue completing river restoration work. Category 3 that would have no public access and maybe limited restoration. And then a category 4 that Charlie hinted at, which were parcels that we deemed necessary to divest of. So if it's between 2 houses, maybe we could find a landowner to acquire it and retain a conservation easement to prevent development still.
About 4 or 5 years ago, I believe, could be longer, time flies after these events, we divested of about 25 parcels, primarily in the Drake region of the Big Thompson River corridor. Can you go back to that map? And the thinking was that we would, if you look at the Forks Park area, you see Drake there, that's where we did quite a few divestments of property interest. We sold properties that were deed restricted back to adjacent landowners. They were deed restricted to the extent that they could not build upon them, and they could only use them for private recreation and picnicking and those sorts of things. And of course, it wasn't a financial goal to make money on this, but it was to get the land back in the hands of landowners who could maybe take better care of these parcels. In that process, we retained from the top of the bank of the river through the river corridor. And the reason for that was so that we could maintain public access, which is a very high demand resource within the Big Thompson River corridor.
So just a few photos of some of the damage that occurred to the various parcels that the county owned. These are all post-2013 flood. This is a toilet that was at our Forks Park that whoever was the floodplain modeler at the time post-76 flood did a great job in making sure that this toilet was just outside of the floodplain and actually survived. And lest you think Larimer County is super frugal, we were able to reuse this toilet in its entirety, but we did change out the toilet paper in the trash bag. We all 4 of these parks pre-flood had parking and river access. They were all determined to be either category 1 or 2. So those were the categories where we would allow or reinstate public access following the flood. And in 3 of those park areas, we have completed river restoration work in partnership with the coalition and CDOT with grant funds from the Colorado Water Conservation Board and others. So here's just a couple pictures today. Here's that toilet at Forks Park near some of the parcels we divested, but everything in this picture we retained. And we worked pretty closely with CDOT to model this parking lot and the floodplain to make sure that you can see the river has quite a bit of room over to the left to move still in this area. And we really want to make sure that our parking lot didn't have a cumulative impact downstream by constricting the river or other things. So we feel pretty proud about that. And then a couple photos of some of the river restoration work. It's a little hard to see because things aren't quite greened up yet in this picture, but a lot of willow stakes and pool riffle sections of the stream that were rebuilt.
So as we've mentioned, we have the parcels that we received from the 1976 flood, and in particular in the Cedar Cove area, we have about 14 parcels along with the city of Loveland. The Forest Service has some nearby ownership, and we envision in this area to, excuse me, to have some form of limited access for the public. The map that you're looking at there is in green is the county ownership, and you see the parcel that's labeled as Horn. That is one parcel that we did purchase for post-flood value after the flood. And it made a lot of sense because it was sandwiched in between the county parcels up there. We continue to try to acquire more property interest in this area. But as Nicole mentioned, after a flood, there's a lot of emotions you have to deal with, and people have lost family members. And in particular, in this area, there were 2 people that lost their lives in the 2013 flood. And a number more were lost in 1976 in this area. So this is a good example of an area where it makes total sense to have conservation to deal with the river corridor. This is an example of Cedar Cove on the left, which was pretty much channelized after CDOT came through. And then you can see in this other photo where the banks were laid back to create more room for the river corridor. And that's actually a bridge right there that survived the flood. We had many bridges that were ripped out in the 2013 flood. This is the Cache La Poudre area, and it flows from Rocky Mountain National Park to the South Platte. And Larimer County Natural Resources considers this a high priority conservation area, along with the city of Fort Collins and other entities. And we have 764 acres of conserved land, a regional trail corridor that spans from LaPorte all the way to Greeley. That'll be 52 miles of public benefit with trails. And in particular, we have the River Bluffs open space, and the photograph that you're looking at there is a 300 or 400 acre conservation easement that is known as the Three Bell Conservation Easement, where we worked with the landowner to protect that property in partnership with Great Outdoors Colorado, the landowner, and the city of Fort Collins.
All right, and then just for the last minute or two here, we just want to show you some of the work we're doing along the Poudre River. As Charlie mentioned, the Poudre didn't see some of the same flood flows, but mostly there was minimal infrastructure and damage through the city of Fort Collins and beyond, mostly because a lot of the area is already conserved and between city of Fort Collins, Larimer County, and others. And River Bluffs is one of those properties. We conserved it back in 2005. And you can see from these 2 aerials in the 50s, prior to the highway being built, Highway 392, the river had a lot of room to move, but it was constricted when the highway was built. And you can see the river channel is fairly straight as of 1963. After the county purchased this property, this is what it looks like today, almost like a canal more than a free-flowing river. And our goals have been to remove a lot of the riprap, improve the floodplain connectivity, create some pool riffle structure, and minimize some of the erosion that you see in these photos. We have received a grant to the tune of $1.3 million from DOLA and smaller grants from CPW and Great Outdoors Colorado. And combined with our own funding of about $360,000 from our sales tax, we're about to start a $1.6 million project in the next month. And here's just a quick diagram showing how we'll put some of those pool riffle ratios in and reconnect the floodplain out to the old oxbow to the west. So stay tuned. We should have some information on our website about that if you want more detail over time. Otherwise, that's our last slide. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Charlie. That was great to get into some of those details here. So at this point, we have about 5 minutes left. Everyone who's attending the webinar should have sort of a dialog box from the GoToWebinar. If you have any questions at this point for our experts here, that would be great. I think we actually have a few. I'm trying to pull them up. Okay, so the first one we have is just asking about if the slides will be available. We're going to send all this information along with the handouts and the Room for the River report and a bunch of other resources to folks after, shortly after, once we get the webinar sort of preloaded and up on our Planning for Hazards website. So yes, all the materials will be accessible. Again, if anyone else has any questions, we have just a few more minutes left over for, let's see here, for our folks to take advantage of the experts on the phone. So yeah, again, another question from Dustin, and it was referring to the reports if they're going to be available, and again, we'll send those out to folks that were on the phone as well as folks that might have missed the presentation. Dustin asked another question, and Dustin, maybe you can clarify. The question is, what do you think you would do differently? And is that referring to some of the post-disaster recovery projects, or who is this being directed to, Dustin? Okay, while he's answering that, maybe there's one more question popping up there. I'm glad that folks are taking advantage. So this is from Karen Birchtold in the city of Manitou Springs. She said, did most people volunteer to participate in the acquisition program, or did you reach out to them? So I don't know if either Nicole or Megan or Charlie wants to answer that question.
So for Boulder County, information was provided about the buyout program, but it's an entirely voluntary program. So yeah, information was shared, and some essentially, I guess, recruitment was done by getting that information in the hands of folks who could benefit from the program, but it is an entirely voluntary program. I don't know if that answers the question.
And I'll discuss Larimer County's buyout program. Ours was quite a bit different. It was a post-flood value buyout program. And as I said, we acquired one parcel. The others that were eligible elected not to sell their property and have retained it for their own use, or have sold it to other adjacent landowners.
Okay.
But we did reach out to them in the beginning and had very little activity in terms of people wanting to move forward.
Great. Thanks, Charlie. We have time for one last question, and this is from Miriam McGalvery, and it is, do either of the counties have long-range policies to better prepare for flood hazards before they happen, especially since floodways tend to change after each flood?
I'll answer. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, the floodplains are being remapped. So there'll be a new set of plans that come out for the Big Thompson River and other rivers in the area. So going forward, that'll be used for future planning.
Yeah, and I would just say with regard to the question about the flood plain changing following floods, I would just mention that Boulder County's just gone through and is in the later stages of a major flood plain remapping project that takes into consideration the current conditions. And in terms of looking ahead, we are definitely doing quite a bit to gather all our lessons learned together, all of our stakeholders within the county with institutional knowledge of how things went post 2013 flood, and we've got a resiliency team looking to plan and take advantage of opportunities to mitigate better and plan better for the next inevitable flood.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. Well, I want to be respectful. Go ahead, Charlie.
I would say that Larimer County has also beefed up its emergency response for these situations. We've hired an emergency program manager. What's her official title?
Emergency Operations Center.
Yeah. But anyway, so we've put personnel in place, one individual in particular who's coming up with plans for the future to deal with any kind of disaster, whether it be flood or fire, which we've experienced both in the last 5 years.
Great. So we are just about a couple minutes over 1 o'clock. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but a huge thank you to all of our subject matter experts and folks on the phone, both Nicole Moen and Nicole Wobus, as well as Charlie and Megan from Larimer County. Huge thank you for your participation and for talking to folks about this really important topic. Lastly, as we kind of close things down, I will send an email with, again, all the resources that we discussed here on this webinar, as well as some additional information here, hopefully in the next couple of days, once we get everything pulled together and the webinar closed up. So look for an email from me, and thanks again to everyone on the phone, as well as our subject matter experts here, and look for our next upcoming series in 2019 for the Planning for Hazards webinars, and stay tuned. Okay, thanks.